The night was heavy with heat and silence, the kind of silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. Deep inside the mountains, the SEAL team moved like shadows, their boots barely disturbing the dust and loose stones of the narrow trail. They had been sent into the valley on what had seemed like a straightforward reconnaissance mission, a chance to confirm intelligence about a weapons cache hidden inside an abandoned compound. But in combat zones, straightforward was often just a cruel joke, and as the hours stretched on, the team began to feel the weight of unseen eyes on them. The village below looked deserted from the ridge, the clay walls broken and scattered, the alleys narrow and winding like veins of a labyrinth. Captain Reeves, the team leader, signaled a halt, crouching behind a cluster of jagged rocks as he studied the valley through his night vision scope. What he saw didn't sit right with him. A place could be empty, but this felt too empty, too still, the silence almost hostile. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, an instinct born of countless missions in hostile terrain. He lowered the scope, clenched his jaw and whispered into comms, "Stay sharp. This place stinks of an ambush." The SEALs began their descent with the kind of discipline that only years of training could give, fanning out across the terrain, every man watching the angles, weapons steady, ears tuned to the faintest sound. For 30 minutes they moved through the dry, ghostly streets of the village, stepping over broken timbers and collapsed roofs, the smell of dust and old smoke clinging to the air. At first, it seemed the village was truly abandoned, but then the telltale sign appeared. A fresh boot print in the dirt, still sharp at the edges, too new to have been left long ago. Reeves crouched, tracing it with his finger before glancing up at his men. Their expressions told him everything. This wasn't good. He raised a hand to signal, but before the gesture was fully complete, the night ripped open with gunfire. Bullets tore through the silence, hammering against the mud walls, ricocheting off stone, the crack of AKs echoing from every direction at once. The SEALs hit the ground instantly, returning fire with precise, brutal bursts. Muzzle flashes danced in the dark, enemy fighters darting in and out of doorways, rooftops alive with shadows. It was a kill box and the team was right in the middle of it. Reeves barked orders, shifting his men to better cover, but it was clear they were outnumbered, maybe 3-1, maybe worse. The enemy had waited for them to enter the choke point, and now every exit seemed to rain fire. The squad's medic, Torres, dragged one of the younger operators behind a collapsed wall after he took shrapnel from an RPG blast. The explosion had knocked half the street into rubble, dust clouds choking the air, every breath harsh in their throats. Machine gun fire opened from the far side of the valley, tracer rounds slicing through the night like molten arrows. The team fought back with the ferocity of men who had no choice, controlled bursts from their M4S and the deep thud of the M249 saw ripping into the enemy's cover, but for every target they dropped, 2 more appeared from hidden tunnels and side streets. Reeves knew they had to call in support and fast, or this valley would become their grave. He slammed down behind cover and keyed his comms, his voice tight but steady. "Overlord, this is Phantom 1. We're in contact, heavy contact. Need immediate air support. Coordinates transmitting now." Static hissed for a moment before the calm voice of command came back, but even calm couldn't hide the undertone of urgency. "Copy, Phantom 1. Fast movers are 10 minutes out. Hold your position." 10 minutes. 10 minutes might as well have been a lifetime under this kind of fire. Reeves gritted his teeth. 10 minutes in a kill zone was the difference between extraction and body bags. He relayed the word to his men, who nodded grimly, each one fighting with the knowledge that every second mattered. The enemy pressed harder, sensing the team's vulnerable position, launching another RPG that detonated against a nearby wall, showering the operators with dirt and fragments. O'Neill, the team's breacher, cursed as he fired a shotgun blast into a doorway before switching back to his rifle, his face streaked with grime and sweat. "Boss, we can't sit here like ducks," he shouted over the cacophony. Reeves knew he was right, but there was no safe path out. They were surrounded and the only way out was through. He made the call to push toward the northern edge, where the ground sloped toward open fields, hoping to buy time until the jets arrived. "North side. Move on me," he ordered, and the team began bounding in disciplined leaps, covering each other as they advanced, bullets hissing past them, the enemy howling in the dark. They were halfway through the shift when one of the enemy's PKM gunners pinned them down, his weapon spraying long bursts that chewed through the thin walls like paper. Reeves ducked back, his heart pounding, when suddenly the sound they had been waiting for finally cut through the chaos. A low, distant rumble at first, then growing louder, deeper, until the very ground seemed to vibrate. But it wasn't the scream of jets, it was heavier, slower, a presence that carried dread for anyone on the wrong side of it. Reeves looked up, eyes widening, and for the first time that night, a flicker of hope burned in his chest. The AC-130 had arrived. The low growl turned into a dominating hum that filled the valley like the arrival of some ancient beast, the kind of sound that made men on the ground pause even in the middle of killing. The SEALs looked skyward, their eyes catching the faint silhouette against the star-sprinkled sky, the massive gunship circling with predatory patience. For the enemy fighters it was a death omen. The AC-130, callsign Reaper 21, had been rerouted when command realized fast movers would never arrive in time. Its crew was already locked into action, eyes pressed to sensors, targeting pods painting the battlefield with invisible light. Reeves pressed his comms again, voice hoarse but filled with urgency. Reaper 21, this is Phantom 1, we're pinned, north side of the village, danger close. Paint the rooftops and south alley. A crisp voice came back, cool and professional. Phantom 1, we have eyes on. Confirm friendlies marked with IR strobes. Reeves lifted his beacon and flicked it on, the infrared beam invisible to the naked eye but glowing like a flare to the gunship above. Seconds later the valley trembled. The first roar came from the 105mm howitzer, the gunship's most feared weapon. The shell slammed into a rooftop where machine gun fire had been spitting for minutes, the entire structure vanishing in a plume of fire and dust. The concussion rattled windows for blocks, the echo bouncing off the mountains like thunder rolling from the heavens. Before the debris even settled, the 40mm Bofors barked, sending streams of shells ripping through alleyways, tearing apart ambushers who had thought themselves safe in cover. The SEALs seized the chance, pressing forward under the shadow of the circling angel of death, every burst from above clearing another path through the enemy choke points. O'Neill hooped into comms, his voice ragged but triumphant. Hell yeah, Reaper. Keep bringing the rain. Torres dragged his wounded comrade tighter into cover, both of them staring wide-eyed as explosions stitched a line just meters away, the kind of surgical destruction only the AC-130 could deliver. The enemy tried to adapt. Fighters scattered into the maze of the village, some desperate enough to fire RPGs into the night sky, their glowing tails arcing upward before fizzling uselessly as the gunship banked effortlessly away. Every attempt at resistance was answered with brutal precision. A truck barreling toward the northern slope, its bed packed with reinforcements, was obliterated in a single strike, the fireball lighting up the valley like false dawn. The psychological toll was immediate. Those who had been screaming with confidence minutes earlier were now shadows sprinting into the hills, their shouts turning to panicked cries. Reeves seized the moment, rallying his men. On me. Push north while they're breaking. His voice carried strength again, the kind of command that cut through chaos like steel. The SEALs advanced through rubble and flame, every footstep timed with the rhythm of fire from above. The AC-130's crew spoke in calm bursts over the net, their targeting officer describing impacts, confirming kills, directing fire with almost surgical calm. To the men on the ground, it was like fighting under the hand of a god. Even so, the fight wasn't over. From a collapsed mosque near the center of the village, heavy fire erupted, a last stand by a determined cell of insurgents. Tracer rounds slashed through the dark, forcing the SEALs to ground again. Reeves cursed, knowing they were still in danger if that position held. He keyed comms again, voice sharp. Reaper 21, we need that mosque neutralized now. The gunship circled tighter, sensors locking on, and then the 105mm thundered again. The blast consumed the entire structure, the minaret crumbling like a toy, flames reaching for the sky. The shooting stopped as quickly as it had begun, the valley falling into a stunned silence broken only by the groans of collapsing walls and the hiss of fires eating through dry wood. But silence in war was never peace, only an interlude. As the SEALs pushed toward the fields, a new wave emerged from hidden tunnels at the base of the mountains, dozens of silhouettes charging, some screaming, some firing wildly. It was a last desperate attempt to overwhelm the Americans before escape. Reeves felt the weight of the moment. If they broke through here, it could all be over. He dropped to a knee, aimed and fired in steady rhythm, his rounds cutting down the lead fighters. His men did the same, the discipline of years of training keeping their lines tight even against the rush of chaos. Above, the gunship roared to life again, its cannons speaking in a steady rhythm, lines of fire tearing across the field. The charging wave evaporated under the rain of steel, men thrown into the dirt, weapons clattering uselessly beside broken bodies. The few who survived turned and fled, vanishing into the black ridges with nothing but terror at their heels. For a brief second, the battlefield stilled. The SEALs held their breath, weapons still aimed, scanning for movement. Only the crackle of burning debris answered them. Reeves lowered his rifle slightly, eyes scanning his team. They were bruised, bloodied, dust coating their faces like ash, but they were alive. Torres still worked on the wounded man, pressure bandage wrapped tight, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. O'Neill reloaded with trembling hands, his earlier adrenaline fading into raw exhaustion. Reeves pressed his comms again, his voice calmer now. Overlord, Phantom 1. Area suppressed. We're moving to extract point. Thanks to Reaper 2-1 we're still breathing. The voice that came back carried relief. Copy, Phantom 1. Bird inbound for pickup. Hold position until arrival. The SEALs pushed into the open field, the moonlight painting them as shadows against silver dust. Behind them, the village smoldered, walls collapsed, fires licking at the sky like angry spirits. The AC-130 continued its circling vigil, cannons silent for now but engines humming, a constant reminder to anyone left watching that death still hung above. Reeves felt the adrenaline draining from his veins, replaced by the heavy weight of survival. They had walked into a trap, been seconds from annihilation, and yet here they stood, because one gunship had answered their call. He glanced skyward, whispering under his breath words no one else could hear. Damn glad you were there. His men followed him across the field, their silhouettes swallowed by the night, the sound of distant rotors approaching like salvation. The field stretched wide before them, a barren strip of earth broken only by patches of scrub and scattered stones, and for a moment it felt like freedom, the open ground leading them toward the promise of escape. But open ground was also exposure, and every operator knew it. The team moved in disciplined bounds, weapons still raised, eyes flicking to the ridgelines that framed the valley like watchful sentinels. Reeves led the advance, his night vision scanning for any hint of movement, while O'Neill and Jackson covered the rear, their barrels cutting smooth arcs across the dark horizon. Above them, the AC-130 circled slow and steady, a predator that refused to leave its prey until the job was done. Its crew tracked every corner of the battlefield with unblinking sensors, their calm voices over comms occasionally breaking the silence with quiet confirmations. Phantom 1, you're clear to the north. No movement detected within one click. The reassurance was welcome, but Reeves had been in the field too long to relax. He had seen too many missions where silence preceded violence. The helicopter was inbound, its distant thump faint but growing, a sound that carried both salvation and danger. Enemy ears would hear it too, and desperation made men reckless. Reeves keyed comms, voice low but firm. Stay sharp. We're not home yet. Expect contact on exfil. His men nodded, their movements steady despite exhaustion dragging at their limbs. Torres kept pace with surprising strength, supporting the wounded operator across his shoulder, the man pale but conscious, his teeth gritted against pain. The promise of evacuation kept him moving, each step forced through agony. They reached the shallow rise at the edge of the field, taking cover among a scatter of rocks while waiting for their ride. Dust swirled faintly as the Chinook descended into the valley, its twin rotors chopping the night air into violent currents. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, the wash of rotor blades sending grit into the SEALs' eyes and mouths. And then the world erupted again. From the far ridge, muzzle flashes spat like angry fireflies, the sudden crack of rifles and machine guns tearing into the night. Bullets hissed past, snapping against stone, whipping dirt into the air around the team. Reeves cursed, dragging himself behind cover and shouting into comms. Reaper 2-1 Ridge Line East were taking heavy fire. The response came instantly, the calm voice of the fire control officer. We have eyes on. Danger close, hold your heads down. The gunship rolled into its attack run, and then the valley shook with fury. The 40mm cannons barked in relentless rhythm, a chain of explosions racing across the ridge like a fiery serpent. Fighters who had dared to reveal themselves were shredded where they stood, their bodies flung down the slope as if swatted by an invisible giant. The SEALs stayed crouched, dust raining. Down on their helmets, the concussions pounding their chests like hammers. The Chinook dipped lower, its crew aware they had only minutes to load and lift before becoming a target themselves. Reeves gave the order. Move. Now. The SEALs broke from cover, sprinting across the final stretch of open ground, bullets still slashing at them from pockets of resistance. O'Neill and Jackson laid down covering fire, short bursts that kept enemy heads down while their brothers ran. Torres half-dragged, half-carried the wounded man up the ramp, shouting to the crew chief for immediate medical. Reeves was last to board, firing a final burst before turning and leaping into the bird. The crew chief slapped the fuselage twice, a signal to lift, and the Chinook clawed skyward, engine screaming as it rose out of the kill zone. But the enemy wasn't finished. From a concealed position near the base of the ridge, a rocket streaked into the night, its fiery trail cutting straight toward the climbing helicopter. Time seemed to slow. Reeves saw it in the corner of his vision, his gut seizing in horror. Before he could shout, the AC-130 spoke again. The 25mm Gatling cannon unleashed a torrent of rounds, a storm of fire that chewed the rocket mid-air, detonating it in a ball of flame well short of the helicopter. The crew erupted in cheers, raw relief mixing with adrenaline. "Reaper 2-1, you just saved our asses," Reeves growled into comms, his voice rough but sincere. The gunship's calm reply floated back, "Just doing our job, Phantom 1. Safe travels." The Chinook banked hard, engine straining as it climbed away from the valley, the village shrinking below into a patchwork of rubble and fire. The SEALs slumped against the fuselage walls, their weapons still in hand but their bodies sagging with exhaustion. Sweat streaked their dust-caked faces, eyes hollow yet burning with the intensity of survival. Torres knelt over the wounded man, checking vitals, murmuring encouragement, his hands steady despite the shaking of the bird. Reeves pulled off his helmet, running a hand through sweat-soaked hair, staring at the deck as though trying to comprehend the thin line that had separated them from death tonight. He looked at his men, each of them alive, and felt a surge of pride cut through the fatigue. They had fought as one, endured as one, and survived because of it. The Chinook leveled out, the cool night air rushing through the open ramp, carrying with it the smell of smoke and cordite. Below them, the valley disappeared into shadow, the fires of the village flickering like dying embers. Reeves leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, but sleep was impossible. His mind replayed the ambush, the desperate firefight, the overwhelming tide of enemy fighters. And above it all, the unrelenting voice of the AC-130, calm and certain, death delivered with surgical precision. Without that gunship, without the crew orbiting above, they would have been nothing more than names etched into a memorial wall. The thought was sobering, a reminder of the thin, fragile line that defined survival in war. As the minutes passed, the noise of battle faded into memory, replaced by the steady hum of engines and the quiet breaths of men who had fought and lived. Reeves finally opened his eyes, looking toward the horizon where the first hints of dawn painted the sky with faint silver. Another day was coming, and with it, another fight somewhere else. But for now they had endured. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small notebook he carried on every mission, scribbling quick notes in jagged handwriting, coordinates, times, fragments of memory that later would become a debrief. He paused for a long moment before writing 2 words across the bottom of the page: "Reaper saved." The Chinook thundered across the night, its rotors beating a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo in the bones of the men huddled inside. The air inside the fuselage was thick with sweat, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. Torres worked steadily over the wounded man, his gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency, murmuring soft encouragement that cut through the mechanical roar. The others sat slumped against the walls, helmets resting on their knees, weapons still cradled in hands that trembled faintly from adrenaline withdrawal. O'Neill stared out the open ramp into the vast darkness below, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion, the fire of battle still flickering in his eyes. Jackson leaned his head back, breathing slow and deep, his body trembling with the aftershock of combat. They had survived the ambush, endured the kill box, and escaped with their lives, but the weight of what they had endured pressed down on them like lead. Reeves sat apart, his eyes fixed on nothing, the noise of the engines muffled by the storm of thoughts inside his head. He replayed the night in fragments, the eerie silence of the village before the trap was sprung, the sudden eruption of fire from every direction, the desperation in Torres's voice as he worked on the wounded, the sound of the AC-130's guns ripping through the dark with merciless precision. Without that gunship, without the calm voices of its crew guiding fire with surgical intent, his men would be dead. He felt both gratitude and unease, gratitude for their salvation, unease at how close they had come to annihilation. A commander was supposed to bring his team home, and tonight it had been inches away from failure. He clenched his jaw, forcing the thoughts back, knowing he would have to face them later. For now his men needed strength, not doubt. The Chinook finally banked hard, the lights of the forward operating base glittering in the distance like an island of safety. The crew chief leaned into the compartment, shouting above the rotor wash. 5 minutes to landing. The words carried a weight of relief, a promise that soon the endless night would give way to solid ground and relative safety. The men stirred, checking gear, tightening straps, instinctively preparing for whatever waited when the wheels touched down. No one spoke much, Their silence wasn't emptiness, it was the bond of men who had shared fire and blood, who had walked through death and returned. The Chinook slammed down on the landing pad, dust swirling in a furious storm beneath its rotors. The rear ramp dropped, and the SEALs moved quickly, helping Torres offload the wounded man onto a waiting stretcher. Medics swarmed instantly, rushing him toward the field hospital, their voices urgent but controlled. Reeves watched him disappear into the glare of floodlights before turning back to his team. "Get your gear stowed, weapons cleared. Debrief in 30. His voice was steady, carrying the authority of a man who knew there was no time to collapse. Not yet. The men nodded, moving with weary discipline, their bodies running on autopilot long after their minds had begun to shut down. The base was alive despite the hour, generators humming, vehicles rumbling, radios crackling with reports from other sectors. The SEALs walked through it like ghosts, dust and blood clinging to their uniforms, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Soldiers they passed gave them looks of respect, nods that carried silent acknowledgement of what they had endured. In war, no words were needed. The dirt, the sweat, the 1,000-yard stares told the story clearly enough. Reeves led them into the armory, each man clearing his weapon, stripping magazines, moving through the motions with mechanical precision. Only when the rifles were locked away did some of the tension finally ease from their shoulders. The debrief room was a stark space, concrete walls painted a dull beige, a long table scarred by years of elbows and fists. Command was waiting, 2 senior officers and an intelligence analyst, faces tight with concern. Reeves and his men took their seats, some slumping, others sitting rigid, each man carrying the night in his own way. The lights were too bright, the air too still, the silence heavy until one of the officers broke it. "Phantom 1, we received your sitrep. You walked into a hornet's nest tonight. Start from the beginning." Reeves exhaled slowly, then began to recount the mission in measured tones, his words steady despite the fatigue. He described the approach to the village, the signs of an ambush, the eruption of enemy fire, the desperate call for air support, and the arrival of the AC-130. His voice never wavered, but inside, each memory felt like a blade scraping against his ribs. The intelligence analyst interrupted occasionally, pressing for details on enemy numbers, weapons, tactics. Reeves answered, his memory sharp despite the haze of exhaustion. When he described the enemy emerging from tunnels, the analyst's expression hardened, jotting notes furiously. "That confirms reports of a network in that valley. We'll need engineers to collapse them." Reeves barely heard. His focus was on his men, watching them from the corner of his eye. Torres sat hunched forward, his hands still trembling faintly from the adrenaline of saving a life. O'Neill's jaw worked as if he were grinding his teeth, his leg bouncing restlessly beneath the table. Jackson sat unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on the wall, lost in some place far from the room. They had fought like warriors, but they weren't machines. The cost of survival lingered in the silence between their breaths. When the debrief ended, the officers offered clipped praise, acknowledgments of valor, promises of follow-up. It felt hollow, words spoken in the safety of a room far from the burning village. Reeves nodded, said what needed to be said, then stood. "My men need rest." He led them out, away from the harsh lights, back into the cool night air. The base smelled of fuel and dust, but compared to the acrid smoke of the valley, it was almost clean. They returned to their quarters, small huts lined with bunks and lockers, spaces that felt like home only because they had no choice. Inside, the tension eased slightly. Helmets and vests were stripped off, boots kicked aside, rifles already locked away. Torres sat heavily on his bunk, burying his face in his hands for a moment before pulling them away, forcing himself to breathe. O'Neill lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward in slow spirals, his hands still shaking faintly as he exhaled. Jackson lay flat on his back, staring at the ceiling as if trying to erase the images still burned behind his eyes. Reeves moved among them, saying little, his presence itself a comfort. He sat last, his body aching, his mind still restless. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of distant generators and the occasional thud of helicopters on the pad. Finally O'Neill spoke, his voice rough but honest. "We should be dead right now. If that gunship hadn't shown up." His words trailed off, unfinished but heavy with meaning. Torres nodded slowly, his voice softer. "They kept us alive. All of us." Jackson didn't speak, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the ceiling, as though in silent agreement. Reeves listened, his chest tight. He thought of the AC-130 circling above them, its cannons speaking with unrelenting power, its crew calm and steady as gods of war. He thought of how close they had come to being swallowed by the valley, their names reduced to whispers. And he knew O'Neill was right, they should be dead. But they weren't. And that mattered. Reeves finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. We live because we fight together. Because we don't quit. Because we trust each other, and the ones watching over us. His words settled into the silence, not dramatic, not poetic, just truth. The men absorbed it in their own ways, some with nods, others with silence. Outside, the night stretched on, the war still waiting beyond the wire. But inside that small hut, the SEALs found a fragile peace, the knowledge that tonight they had walked through fire and returned. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another valley, another fight. But for now they were alive, and that was enough. The firefight had stretched into the dead of night, and the SEALs were beginning to feel the weight of hours of non-stop combat pressing down on them. Every corner of the compound seemed alive with hostile fire. Bullets cracked against stone walls, machine gun bursts chewed through wooden beams, and grenades detonated with concussive fury. The air was thick with cordite and dust, and even the strongest among the team felt fatigue clawing at their muscles. Yet in the midst of it, they held on, driven by instinct, training, and the unshakable trust they had in one another. Reyes, the team leader, crawled behind a shattered wall, raised his radio and whispered into it, "We can't hold this position much longer. AC-130, if you're still with us, we need another run, north side, danger close." His voice was ragged but steady. The reply came almost instantly, calm and professional. "Spooky 1-1, copy that, we've got eyes. Mark your position with IR if you can. Stay low." Reyes pulled the infrared strobe from his vest, clipped it to a broken rebar post, and ducked down just as a burst of enemy fire chewed apart the stone inches above his helmet. He clenched his jaw, praying the aircraft could see them through the chaos. Above, at 10,000 feet, the AC-130 was a dark silhouette circling silently against the stars, its gun crew working with machine-like precision. Sensors tracked heat signatures, mapping the battlefield in glowing silhouettes. The fire control officer marked targets, calling them out to the gunners. Within seconds, the big 105mm howitzer boomed again, the round tearing through the night before slamming into a cluster of insurgents trying to advance on the north side. The ground shook violently, and the SEALs felt the hot wave of air from the detonation sweep through the compound. Shouts and screams followed in the enemy lines. Then the 40mm Bofors opened up, stitching fiery arcs across the ridge line where muzzle flashes had been spotted. The enemy fighters who had believed the Americans were on the verge of collapse now found themselves thrown back once more, forced to scatter into the dark like rats under floodlights. "They're pulling back again." Ortega yelled, his M4 snapping as he fired bursts toward the retreating shadows. But Reyes didn't allow relief to wash over him yet. He knew this wasn't the end. The enemy wasn't quitting, they were regrouping, reassessing. And when they came again it would be harder, faster, more desperate. He crawled back to the team, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and looked each man in the eyes. "We hold until dawn. We don't break. You hear me?" They nodded, exhausted but resolute. At that moment, a sudden shriek of rockets lit the night sky. 4 RPGs arced out from the tree line, streaking toward the compound. "Incoming," someone roared, and the men dove for cover. 2 rockets slammed into the courtyard, sending debris flying in a whirlwind. One struck the edge of the wall, collapsing part of it into rubble, while the last exploded harmlessly in the dirt just outside. The shockwave rattled their bones. Amid the smoke and chaos, Michael staggered to his feet, coughing, his helmet askew. Blood trickled from a shallow cut across his temple, but he waved it off. I'm fine," he muttered, grabbing his weapon and firing into the darkness. Above, the AC-130 crew responded with fury. The fire control officer's voice was clipped and precise. "Engage RPG launch site, 40mm 10-round burst." The Bofors thundered, each shot a heavy thud in the sky, and within moments the entire tree line was shredded into splinters, enemy bodies thrown into the air by the relentless barrage. The gunship rolled slightly, lining up for another pass, and the 25mm Gatling cannon spat streams of glowing tracers, ripping through another wave of fighters trying to maneuver closer. The battlefield was lit in pulses of fire, like the world's deadliest strobe light. Reyes pressed his back against the wall, panting heavily. He looked at his watch. It was only 0230. Hours to go before dawn, hours that would feel like days. He forced himself to steady his breathing, his mind running through contingencies. Their ammo was running dangerously low, water was nearly gone, every man carried wounds, some minor, some threatening to worsen without care. Yet morale flickered like the strobe of the AC-130's guns, beaten but unbroken. The aircraft was their lifeline, the only thing standing between them and annihilation. In the distance, the insurgents tried to use vehicles, a pair of technicals with mounted heavy machine guns roaring forward across the scrubland. Their gunners opened fire, sweeping the compound with streams of red tracers. Concrete walls shattered and dust filled the air as the SEALs ducked down. "We need that gunship now," Ortega shouted over the din. The radio crackled, Spooky 1-1 eyes on technicals engaging. Then the night split with another thunderclap as the 105mm fired. The first technical was obliterated in a ball of fire, the shockwave rolling across the field. The second swerved hard, trying to escape, but the 40mm found it, pounding the vehicle until it flipped violently, bursting into flames. Cheers erupted briefly among the SEALs, but Reyes cut it short. "Stay sharp, they're testing us. They're not done." His prediction proved right. From the south side, new bursts of gunfire erupted as another element of fighters launched their attack, this time using mortars. The rounds whistled in, slamming into the compound with deafening explosions. Shrapnel tore through walls, ripping into sandbags, and one round landed dangerously close to the team's medical cache, scattering supplies across the ground. Reyes cursed, diving to gather what he could, his gloves shredded by debris. Above, the AC-130 adjusted once more, sensors locking onto the mortar team hidden in a wadi. "Target acquired, 105mm, fire for effect," the fire control officer commanded. The big gun boomed twice more, the detonations obliterating the wadi and silencing the mortars. The crew's discipline was unshakable, their firepower devastating, but the enemy's sheer numbers kept the fight from ending. For every squad that was cut down, another seemed to rise, emboldened by fanaticism or desperation. The SEALs crouched low, trading bursts of fire, conserving ammo, every trigger squeeze measured and precise. In those moments, every man knew that survival hinged not only on skill but on endurance of body, mind, and spirit. The night dragged on, the firefight a brutal rhythm of assault, counterattack, and thunderous reprisal from above. And though exhaustion gnawed at them like wolves, though their supplies dwindled to almost nothing, the SEALs clung to the knowledge that the AC-130 was still circling, still watching, still fighting with them. It wasn't just a machine in the sky, it was their guardian angel, and as long as its guns kept roaring, they still had a chance to see the sunrise. The hours between 3 and 4 in the morning were always the hardest in combat, when exhaustion dug into the bones and the body begged for rest, but the fight allowed no such mercy. The SEALs were running on nothing but grit and instinct now, crouched in the ruins of the compound, their faces caked with dust and sweat, their eyes bloodshot from smoke and fatigue. Ammunition was counted round by round, every bullet precious, every grenade reserved only for the most desperate situations. Still they held, their weapons cracking methodically into the night as shadowy figures tried again and again to breach their defenses. Reyes crawled across the shattered courtyard to check on Michaels, who had taken shrapnel to the leg earlier. The corpseman had tied a hasty tourniquet, but blood had seeped through, staining the bandage a dark red. Michaels gritted his teeth, refusing painkillers so he could keep his wits sharp. "I can still fight," he said through clenched teeth, lifting his rifle. Reyes squeezed his shoulder. "Just stay alive. That's the fight now." He looked at the rest of his team, Ortega, Ramirez, Davis, all of them worn, all of them battered, yet none breaking. They had become a wall, held together not by strength but by an unyielding will forged through years of training and brotherhood. Above them, the drone of the AC-130 was constant, a deep, steady hum that reassured them with every passing minute. It was the only sound in the sky, circling like a predator, scanning every heat signature, every muzzle flash, and answering with thunder. The aircraft had become more than just air support. It was their shield, their savior, their reminder that somewhere beyond this valley they were not alone. But the enemy had realized it too, and they were changing tactics. Instead of charging recklessly into the compound, they began to spread out, firing from multiple angles, trying to stretch the SEALs thin and overwhelm them with sheer pressure. Mortar fire started again, this time more accurate, rounds whistling in and exploding dangerously close. The ground shook with each impact, dust raining from broken walls. Reyes keyed his radio. "Spooky, mortars are walking in on us. Can you find them?" The reply came calm as ever. "Roger, scanning. Stand by." Seconds later, the 105mm boomed, twice in rapid succession. The explosions lit up the southern ridge, silencing the mortars and sending chunks of earth raining down. Reyes exhaled sharply, thankful but knowing the reprieve wouldn't last. At that moment, A sudden flash tore through the sky, tracers streaking upward from the tree line. Anti-aircraft fire. The insurgents had dragged up a heavy machine gun or possibly a manpats, and they were trying to take the AC-130 out of the fight. The SEALs watched in horror as the tracers reached toward their lifeline above. "They're going after Spooky," Ortega shouted. The aircraft immediately banked hard, its crew reacting with practiced precision. The gunners identified the origin of the fire, and within moments the 40mm Bofors lit up, pounding the treeline with explosive shells. The anti-aircraft fire faltered, then stopped entirely, consumed in a storm of steel. The gunship steadied, its orbit re-established, but the near miss left the SEALs rattled. If the AC-130 was ever forced away, even for a short time, they knew they'd be overrun. That thought alone made them fight harder, every trigger squeeze fueled by desperation. The enemy responded with their largest push yet. Dozens of fighters charged across the scrubland, firing wildly, their voices rising in a chorus of shouts meant to break the American spirits. RPGs streaked through the night, smashing into the compound with bone-rattling force. One rocket collapsed what remained of the north wall, opening a gap wide enough for attackers to pour through. Reyes was there in seconds, firing controlled bursts, his rifle bucking in his hands as shadows leapt through the dust. Ortega joined him, hurling a grenade that detonated with a deafening crack, scattering bodies. Ramirez, perched on a higher piece of rubble, rained down fire with his M240, the weapon's roar echoing like a machine of war. But still they came, endless, tireless, like a tide determined to drown them. Above, the AC-130 unleashed hell. The 25mm Gatling cannon shredded fighters in swaths, cutting down entire groups before they could close the distance. The 40mm followed, each burst tearing holes in the charging lines. Finally, the 105mm roared again, its massive shells obliterating the reinforcements gathering near the treeline. The ground shook with each impact, the earth itself seeming to rebel against the onslaught. Yet even amid the destruction, pockets of enemy fighters managed to slip closer, darting through smoke and debris to press the attack inside the compound itself. Suddenly the fight was hand-to-hand, rifles abandoned for knives and pistols, fists and fury. Reyes drove his shoulder into a fighter, slamming him against the wall before finishing him with his sidearm. Ortega grappled with another, rolling in the dirt before plunging a blade into his opponent's chest. Ramirez swung the butt of his machine gun like a hammer, clearing space around him. The compound became a maelstrom of chaos, lit only by muzzle flashes and the burning wrecks outside. In the middle of it all, Michaels, despite his wound, kept firing from a crouched position, his face pale but determined. He cut down 2 fighters who had breached the perimeter, his shots precise despite the pain. His voice rang out hoarse but steady, "You're not taking us, not tonight." The SEALs fought like wolves cornered, every second survival, every movement life or death. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the surge faltered. The enemy, cut down by the relentless fire from above and the unbreakable defense below, began to retreat, dragging their wounded into the darkness. The compound fell silent except for the crackle of flames and the ragged breaths of the survivors. Reyes slumped against a wall, chest heaving, his rifle heavy in his hands. He scanned his men, alive, bloodied, battered but alive. He lifted his radio with trembling fingers. "Spooky, this is Reaper Team. If you can hear me, you kept us alive. We owe you everything." From above came the calm, steady voice of the fire control officer. "Roger that, Reaper. We're not going anywhere. Stay strong. Dawn's coming." Reyes closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. Dawn was still hours away and he knew the enemy would try again, maybe with even greater fury. But for now, in this fleeting moment of quiet, the SEALs had survived another wave. And as long as the AC-130 circled overhead, thundering its defiance into the night, hope remained. The hours dragged on like an endless nightmare, each minute stretching under the weight of exhaustion and unrelenting danger. The SEALs crouched within the ruins of the compound, their bodies battered, their weapons scarred, their ammo nearly spent, yet their resolve unbroken. The battlefield was a shattered landscape of smoke, fire, and twisted steel, the stench of gunpowder and burned flesh heavy in the air. The lull between attacks was deceptive, like the breath a storm takes before tearing the world apart again. Reyes crouched low, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where faint movements stirred in the darkness. The enemy had not been defeated, they had only been delayed. He could feel it in his bones, the way the earth seemed to quiver with unseen footsteps, the way the silence pressed too heavily, too deliberately. "They're coming again," he muttered, his voice rough but steady. Ortega, crouched beside him with his rifle cradled close, gave a grim nod. Last push. They're throwing everything at us before the sun comes up. Michael sat against a wall, his leg bandaged tight, pale with blood loss but still clutching his weapon. Then we throw it back. Whatever's left of it. Davis was checking the last of their gear, his eyes hard, movements precise despite the weariness etched into every line of his face. 3 mags between us. Couple of grenades. That's it. We make it count. They all knew what those numbers meant. It wouldn't be enough against another human wave. Not without the Guardian circling above. Reyes keyed his radio, his voice low but edged with urgency. Spooky, this is Dagger 1. They're massing again, looks like south and west. We're dry on ammo. If you've got anything left, we're going to need it. The reply came, calm and unwavering despite the chaos below. Copy that, Dagger 1. We're with you. Sensors confirm multiple squads moving in your direction, plus technicals. Stand by. We'll cover you. The SEALs exchanged looks, a flicker of hope threading through the exhaustion. The AC-130 had already poured untold fire into the battlefield, yet it remained, a sentinel in the sky refusing to abandon them. The men dug in, setting their final positions, watching the horizon where shadows were gathering. Then the night exploded. From the tree line came a roar of gunfire, hundreds of muzzle flashes tearing open the darkness. Mortar rounds whistled overhead, slamming into the compound with brutal detonations. Shrapnel screamed through the air, clanging off stone, slicing through sandbags. The ground shook and smoke filled their lungs, choking and bitter. Through the haze, Reyes saw them. The enemy surging in waves, hundreds strong, their silhouettes swarming across the field like a living tide. Technicals roared at their flanks, heavy guns mounted in the beds spewing streams of tracers. They're coming heavy. Ortega shouted, opening fire, each shot deliberate, controlled. Davis raked the front ranks with his saw until the belt ran empty, then tossed it aside and switched to his rifle, teeth bared in a snarl. Michaels braced his weapon despite the blood soaking his leg, firing with grim defiance. The SEALs fought with everything they had left, but the numbers were overwhelming. For every man they dropped, 3 more took his place. Grenades flew, detonating among the attackers, but still they pressed forward, stepping over their dead, screaming war cries into the night. The compound walls shuddered under the assault, pieces collapsing as fighters scrambled to climb over. Reyes dropped 2 with precise shots, then ducked as a burst of machine gun fire shredded the wall above him. His radio crackled with the voice from above. Dagger 1, Spooky 1-1. We've got the mass engaging danger close. Hold tight. And then hell fell from the sky. The AC-130 opened up with everything it had left. The 25mm Gatling cannon screamed, tracers streaming down like fiery rain, tearing into the charging ranks. The 40mm thudded, each burst ripping gaps in the flood of bodies. The 105mm thundered, earth splitting as shells cratered the ground, fire and dirt erupting in plumes that consumed men and machines alike. The technicals were the first to go, one torn apart by cannon fire, the other flipped into the air by a 105mm blast that left nothing but fire and twisted wreckage. The SEALs felt the shockwaves rattle their bones, but they held their ground, firing into the chaos, the roar of their rifles drowned out by the wrath raining from above. The enemy ranks broke, then reformed, then broke again, each attempt at cohesion ripped apart by the relentless fury of the gunship. Bodies littered the field, glowing white in the AC-130 sensors, shadows torn into fragments by the unending barrage. But still some pressed on, crawling through rubble, screaming in defiance, reaching the very edges of the compound. Reyes and Ortega fought hand to hand as one insurgent vaulted the wall, slamming into them with a knife. Ortega caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his own blade home, the enemy collapsing in a heap. Michaels, pale and trembling, dragged himself to cover and dropped 2 more with his rifle before slumping against the wall, barely conscious but refusing to let go of his weapon. Davis hurled his last grenade into a cluster trying to breach the courtyard, the blast hurling them back in pieces. His ears rang, vision blurred, but he reloaded and kept firing. Above, the AC-130 circled tighter, its crew methodical, voices calm even as they unleashed destruction on a biblical scale. Target 200 meters west, engage. 105 ready. Fire. Impact. Target neutralized. Their discipline was iron, their will unshakable. They were as much a part of the fight as the men on the ground, invisible comrades bound by duty and fire. The minutes bled together, each one a lifetime. The compound was shaking itself apart, reduced to rubble and flame, yet somehow still standing. The enemy, once so confident in their numbers, were breaking. Their screams grew fewer, their fire less coordinated, their charges faltering. Reyes, blood streaking his face, rose to his knees and fired into the smoke, each shot driven by sheer defiance. "We hold," he roared, his voice cracking but fierce. "We hold until dawn." His men echoed him with their weapons, with their resolve, with every ounce of fight left in them. The AC-130 roared overhead, its guns still thundering, and for the first time that night the enemy's will cracked. Fighters broke ranks, some fleeing back into the tree line, others dropping their weapons and disappearing into the dark. The tide that had threatened to drown the SEALs finally ebbed, leaving silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the labored breathing of the survivors. Reyes collapsed back against the wall, chest heaving, his rifle slipping from his hands. Ortega slumped beside him, grinning through blood and ash. "Still here?" he rasped. Michaels raised a shaky thumb, his eyes half shut. Davis leaned back, face streaked with dirt, exhaustion etched into every line, but his eyes alive with the fire of survival. Above them, the AC-130 banked in its orbit, silent now, its guns cooling, its crew watching the field below with the same quiet determination they had carried through every moment of the fight. The night was not yet over, but the worst had passed. Against all odds, against numbers that should have drowned them, the SEALs still held the compound. And as the faintest light of dawn began to touch the horizon, they knew they had lived to see it only because the angel in the sky had refused to leave them behind. The first pale streaks of dawn crept over the jagged ridges, painting the battlefield in shades of gray and muted gold, revealing the wreckage of the night in stark, unforgiving clarity. Smoke still clung to the air, rising from burning vehicles and shattered trees, while the ground was littered with twisted metal and lifeless forms. The compound itself was unrecognizable, reduced to a broken skeleton of walls and rubble. Yet within that ruin the SEALs remained, bloodied but unbroken, each man still clutching his weapon, each chest still rising with the ragged rhythm of survival. Reyes sat with his back against a chunk of collapsed masonry, eyes fixed on the horizon. His face was a mask of exhaustion, streaked with dirt and blood, but his gaze burned steady. Dawn had always been their finish line, the promise that if they could hold until the first light, they might yet live to see another day. Ortega slumped beside him, his hands black with soot, his uniform torn and scorched, yet his grin remained even through the pain. "Guess what, boss?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "Looks like we made it." Reyes gave a slow nod, too drained for words. Across the courtyard, Davis was propped against a wall, his saw discarded at his side, eyes scanning the field with the instinct of a man who refused to let his guard drop even when the fight seemed over. Michaels, pale and drenched in sweat, clutched his rifle with white-knuckled determination, the wound in his leg still bleeding through makeshift bandages, but his gaze was clear, sharp with the knowledge that he had endured. The radio crackled suddenly, its static slicing through the fragile silence. Reyes snatched it up, his voice raw. "Dagger 1 still here. We've held the compound. Over." A calm reply came through, steady and grounding. "Copy that, Dagger 1. Extraction inbound. 30 mics. Sit tight. You're not alone." For the first time all night, a weight lifted from Reyes's chest. Extraction meant survival. Extraction meant they hadn't fought in vain. He lowered the radio slowly, letting the words settle over his men. "Birds are coming. Half an hour." Ortega let out a ragged laugh, shaking his head. "Half an hour feels like a lifetime right now." Davis grunted. "After last night? Half an hour is nothing." But though hope stirred among them, vigilance remained. The battlefield was never truly silent, and though the enemy had been shattered, scattered, and broken by the relentless wrath of the AC-130, the chance of a final desperate strike lingered. Reyes ordered rotations, each man taking a sector, eyes sharp despite the fatigue gnawing at their bones. Above them the AC-130 still circled, its engines a low, steady thrum in the morning air. It had been their guardian through the endless night, and now it remained their shield, ready to strike if the enemy dared to rise again. Reyes looked up at the dark silhouette cutting across the dawn sky and felt a surge of gratitude so profound it left him momentarily speechless. That crew, unseen and unknown to him, had saved their lives 100 times over. Without them the compound would have been a tomb. He pressed a hand against his chest as though anchoring the weight of that truth deep inside him. Minutes crawled by, each one heavy with the ache of exhaustion. The SEALs scavenged what they could, collecting ammo from fallen enemies, readying bandages, pouring the last of their water into cracked lips. Conversation was minimal, each man conserving his strength, their eyes scanning the horizon where the light was growing brighter, shadows shrinking away under the rising sun. Finally, the low thump of helicopter rotors reached their ears, faint at first, then growing louder, steadier, until the sound filled the air with promise. Reyes lifted the radio again. "This is Dagger 1. Visual on extraction." The reply came crisp. "Roger that, Dagger 1. 2 Black Hawks inbound ETA-1 Mike. Mark LZ." Reyes pulled a smoke grenade from his vest, yanked the pin and tossed it into the open courtyard. Thick orange smoke billowed upward, curling into the dawn. Moments later, the Black Hawks swept over the ridge, their rotors kicking up dust and debris as they descended into the makeshift landing zone. Door gunners scanned the perimeter with sharp eyes, ready for any last ambush. The SEALs moved quickly despite their wounds and exhaustion. Reyes helped Michaels to his feet, slinging his arm over his shoulder as Ortega covered them, rifle still at the ready. Davis took the rear, his gaze never leaving the horizon until the last possible second. They sprinted across the shattered courtyard, boots crunching over rubble, the downdraft from the rotors battering them with wind and dust. Clambering aboard the Black Hawk, they collapsed into the metal seats, weapons still clutched in tired hands, every nerve slow to accept that the fight was finally over. The crew chief slapped Reyes on the shoulder, shouting over the roar of the rotors. "You boys look like hell, but you made it." Reyes managed a grim smile. "Hell tried. Didn't take." As the helicopter lifted off, the battlefield spread out below them in grim panorama. The compound was a ruin, the fields beyond scarred with craters and fire, enemy bodies scattered like broken waves. And circling above it all, steady and silent, was the AC-130, the unyielding guardian that had carried them through the storm. Reyes watched it for as long as he could, a black silhouette against the lightening sky, until distance swallowed it from view. He knew he might never meet the men inside, might never know their names or their faces, but he would never forget them. Their guns had been more than weapons. They had been a lifeline, a promise, a shield of steel and will that refused to let the night claim them. As the Black Hawks banked toward safety, Ortega leaned back, closing his eyes for the first time in hours. "That gunship," he muttered, voice drifting toward sleep, "they weren't just keeping us alive. They were making sure we remembered why we fight. Nobody gets left behind." Michaels nodded faintly, his hand still wrapped around his rifle even as his body sagged with exhaustion. Davis stared out the open door, watching the battlefield shrink into the horizon, his jaw tight with unspoken thoughts. Reyes finally let his head rest against the bulkhead, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since the firefight began. The dawn washed over him, warm and steady, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe they had truly survived. They had fought the storm, endured the impossible, and emerged into the light. And they had done it not alone, but with an angel in the sky, a steel guardian whose guns had never faltered, whose presence had never wavered. Long after the scars healed and the memories dulled, the men of Dagger 1 would carry that truth within them, that when the night threatened to swallow them whole, the AC-130 had kept them alive. The end.